There are moments in the Wild West when a single choice changes everything. When one man's decision reveals truths that shake an entire community to its core and force people to question everything they thought they knew about worth and value. This is the story of such a moment, set in the rough frontier town of Timber Ridge, Colorado Territory in 1875. It begins with a desperate father standing on courthouse steps, offering his 3 daughters in marriage to save his family from ruin, and ends with a lesson about seeing with the heart instead of the eyes. The man who taught that lesson was called the Mountain Man, a giant named Elijah Stone who lived alone in the high peaks and came to town only twice a year. What he did on one autumn day became legend, a tale passed down through generations about the daughter everyone mocked, the choice nobody expected, and the love that proved the whole town wrong about what truly matters in this world. Elijah Stone was the kind of man who made people step back when he walked down the street. He stood over 6 feet tall with shoulders like a bull and hands that looked strong enough to snap a man's neck without effort. His black beard hung thick and wild down to his chest, and his hair fell in tangles past his shoulders. He wore buckskin clothes he had made himself and carried a rifle that seemed part of his body. For 15 years, Elijah had lived alone in a cabin high in the mountains, trapping animals and trading furs twice a year in Timber Ridge. The townspeople feared him and respected him in equal measure, whispering stories about the battles he had survived during the war and the reasons he chose isolation over civilization. Mothers pulled their children close when he passed by, and men nodded but kept their distance. Nobody really knew Elijah Stone, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But loneliness is a strange thing that grows quietly in a man's chest. And even the strongest person eventually needs more than mountains and silence to keep him whole. On a cool October morning, Elijah came down from his mountain cabin with a load of beaver pelts and wolf skins to trade. He tied his mule outside the general store and went inside to conduct his business with the same few words he always used, avoiding eye contact with curious townspeople who stared at him like he was a wild animal. He was loading supplies onto his mule when shouting erupted from the town square that made everyone stop and turn. A man named Samuel Hartwell stood on the courthouse steps with desperation written across his weathered face, calling out to the gathering crowd. Samuel had once owned a successful ranch outside town, but disasters had destroyed him one after another. Drought killed his cattle, disease took his horses, and debts piled so high the bank was about to seize everything. Samuel was a widower with 3 daughters, and no way to save them from poverty. What he announced that morning shocked every person who heard it and drew gasps from the assembled crowd. Samuel declared in a voice shaking with shame that he would give any of his 3 daughters in marriage to a man of decent character who would take on his debts and save his family. It was a desperate offer that sounded like something from 100 years earlier, but on the harsh frontier where survival mattered more than pride, such arrangements were not impossible to imagine. Samuel's 3 daughters stood behind him on those courthouse steps, each one showing a different face to the town. The oldest daughter was Caroline, 23 years old, with golden hair that caught the sunlight and features so delicate she looked like a painting. She stood straight and confident, certain that some wealthy rancher would choose her and solve all their problems. The middle daughter was Margaret, 21, known throughout Timber Ridge for her sweet nature and skills at cooking and sewing. She looked nervous but hopeful, twisting her hands together as she waited, but it was the youngest daughter who made people whisper and shake their heads with pity. Her name was Ada, and she had just turned 19. Though most people in town barely noticed she existed, Ada had been born with a twisted left foot that made her walk with a heavy limp, dragging that leg behind her with each painful step. A scar ran down her left cheek from a childhood accident when a horse had kicked her, leaving a mark that society used to judge her worthless. The scar was not even terrible, just a pale line along her face. But in a world that valued women mainly for beauty, it was enough to make her invisible. Ada kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her thin shoulders hunched forward, as if she was trying to disappear into herself. She knew what everyone thought about her. She had heard the whispers since childhood, the cruel jokes about poor Samuel being cursed with a daughter no man would ever want. Even her own sisters sometimes looked at her with embarrassment, as if her mere existence somehow made them less valuable. Ada had accepted long ago that she would never marry, would spend her life caring for her father until he died, and then become a burden her sisters would have to bear. She never complained or showed bitterness. She simply tried to take up as little space as possible in a world that did not want her. Men in the crowd immediately began discussing Samuel's offer, their eyes going straight to Caroline with her golden hair and pretty face. A few looked at Margaret, considering her reputation for good cooking and gentle disposition. But not one man's gaze stayed on Ada for more than a heartbeat before sliding away, as if she was not even part of the arrangement, despite standing right there on the steps. Samuel saw this and felt shame burn hot in his chest. But he was too desperate to let pride interfere. He began describing his ranch land, explaining that despite the debts, the property itself was good and could prosper again with hard work and investment. As men stepped forward with questions about the details and the debt amounts, Elijah Stone stood frozen beside his mule, watching the scene with eyes that had seen too much suffering to ignore it now. Something about Ada standing there accepting her worthlessness as if it was simply the truth struck him like a physical blow. Elijah understood what it meant to be judged and cast aside, to be seen as wrong or frightening simply for being different. Without fully understanding why, Elijah found his feet carrying him toward the courthouse steps. The crowd parted before him like he was Moses walking through the Red Sea, people stepping back from the massive figure of the mountain man. Samuel Hartwell's eyes went wide as Elijah approached, unsure if this wild stranger was about to help or cause trouble. Elijah stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at Samuel with eyes that had witnessed death and loneliness in equal measure. His voice came out rough and deep, unused to speaking after months alone in the mountains. He asked Samuel to explain the terms clearly, to lay out exactly what he was offering. Samuel, surprised that the fearsome mountain man was even interested, explained that he would sign his ranch over to any decent man who would marry one of his daughters and take responsibility for paying the family debts. The man would get land and a wife, while Samuel and his daughters would be saved from losing everything. It was business as much as marriage, but such arrangements were not uncommon where survival trumped romance. Elijah nodded slowly, his bearded face impossible to read, and then he spoke words that made the entire crowd fall silent with shock. He told Samuel he would accept the offer, would take the ranch, the debts, and a wife. Samuel's face flooded with relief, and he immediately began talking about Caroline, describing her beauty and accomplishments, naturally assuming the mountain man would choose the prettiest daughter. Several men in the crowd looked disappointed, having hoped to claim Caroline for themselves. But Elijah raised one massive hand to stop Samuel's speech, and what came out of his mouth next came the moment that people would remember and talk about for 50 years. Elijah pointed directly at Ada and said clearly that she was the one he chose. If Samuel was serious about his offer, then Elijah would marry Ada, take the debts, and accept the ranch deed. The crowd erupted in gasps and whispers of disbelief. Caroline's face flushed with anger at being passed over. Margaret looked utterly confused. Samuel stood speechless, unable to process what he was hearing. And Ada lifted her eyes from the ground for the first time, staring at Elijah with shock so complete she seemed to have stopped breathing. Samuel stammered that surely Elijah had misunderstood, that he could choose any daughter he wanted, that Caroline was the eldest and most beautiful. But Elijah's eyes stayed locked on Ada's face as he repeated his choice with absolute certainty. He wanted Ada as his wife, and if Samuel would not keep his word, then there was no deal at all. The crowd's whispers grew louder, with some people suggesting the mountain man was playing a cruel joke or had lost his mind from too many years alone. But a few of the oldest women in town, those who had lived long enough to see past the surface of things, watched Elijah with something like understanding in their weathered faces. They recognized what he was doing and saw wisdom that most of the supposedly civilized townspeople completely lacked. Samuel, desperate and confused but with no other options, finally nodded his agreement. If Elijah truly wanted Ada, then Ada he would have, and may God bless them both." Ada's voice cut through the noise, small and shaking but determined to understand. She asked Elijah directly why he would choose her when he could have either of her beautiful, talented sisters. There was no false modesty in her question, only genuine confusion, because the world had taught her she had nothing of value to offer any man. Elijah took 2 steps closer to where she stood, and when he spoke, his rough voice carried across the silent square so everyone could hear. He told Ada that he had been watching her while her father made his desperate speech, had seen how she stood with quiet dignity even though the situation was humiliating, had noticed she did not cry or complain but simply bore what could not be changed. He said he had spent 15 years alone in the mountains because he could not stomach the falseness of society, the way people valued appearances over substance, and missed what truly mattered. He told her that beauty fades like flowers in winter, and charm can hide a rotten heart, but character lasts forever, and kindness is more precious than gold. He saw character in her strength, saw kindness in how she had touched her father's arm to comfort him in his shame. Elijah said that if Ada would have him, he would be honored to call her his wife, and he would spend every day of his life making certain she never felt invisible or worthless again because she was neither of those things. Tears poured down Ada's scarred face as she heard words she had never, in her wildest dreams, expected to hear. Words that treated her not as a burden or an act of charity, but as someone valuable and worth choosing. She nodded yes, because her throat was too tight with emotion to form words. The town preacher was fetched, and within an hour, Ada Hartwell became Ada Stone, in a simple ceremony that most of the town attended out of pure curiosity. Caroline and Margaret stood watching with expressions that mixed confusion with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Samuel signed the ranch deed and debt papers over to Elijah, his hands shaking with relief and wonder at this turn of events. Elijah took Ada's hand with a gentleness that surprised everyone who saw it, and together they walked away from that courthouse toward the ranch that was now their home, leaving behind a crowd of people who would spend years trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The first weeks of marriage were awkward as 2 lonely people learned to share their lives. Elijah had been alone so long he had almost forgotten how to talk to another person, and Ada was so used to being ignored she barely knew how to accept attention. But slowly, through small moments and quiet conversations, they found their way toward each other. Elijah worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing the ranch, fixing broken fences, and tending the few animals that remained. Ada cleaned the neglected house until it shined, cooked meals that filled the rooms with warmth, and slowly began to believe she deserved the kindness Elijah showed her. In the evenings they sat by the fire, and bit by bit they shared their stories. Elijah spoke about the war and the terrible things he had seen that made him unable to live among people who valued the wrong things. Ada talked about growing up feeling broken and wrong, about the casual cruelty of children and the pitying looks from adults. She described learning to find joy in small things like sunrises and wildflowers, because nobody could take those away from her. As autumn turned to winter, something beautiful happened. Elijah and Ada fell in love, not with the wild passion of young fools, but with the deep, steady affection that comes from truly seeing another person's soul and valuing what you find there. Elijah discovered he loved coming home each evening to Ada's smile and the sound of her voice. Ada found that being cherished for who she truly was created a happiness she had not known existed. They worked side by side through that first hard winter, paying off debts little by little, earning respect from neighbors who saw their dedication. The people of Timber Ridge who had whispered about the strange marriage began to notice something that made them uncomfortable. They saw Ada blooming like a flower finally given water, her face losing its hunched, fearful expression and gaining confidence. They saw Elijah, the fearsome mountain man, laughing at something Ada said as they worked together in their garden. By the time spring arrived, the ranch was thriving in ways it never had under Samuel's ownership. Elijah's skill and Ada's careful management made them prosperous, and they paid off the last of the debts by summer. Caroline had married a wealthy rancher, but people noticed she seemed unhappy, always comparing her life to others and finding it lacking. Margaret married a shop owner and seemed content, though her life was ordinary. But Ada, the daughter everyone had mocked and pitied, had something her sisters could not buy or earn through beauty. She had a husband who valued her, a partnership built on respect, and a love that grew stronger with each passing year. When Ada gave birth to their first child the following winter, a healthy baby girl, Elijah wept with joy and declared they would name her Grace because grace was what had brought them together. The years passed with the kind of quiet happiness that does not make for exciting stories, but makes for lives well lived. Elijah and Ada raised 4 children on their ranch, teaching each one that character matters more than appearance and that true worth cannot be measured by what the world thinks. The children grew up watching their parents work together, laugh together, and face hardships side by side with unshakable unity. They learned that their mother had once been considered worthless by society, and their father had been called a savage, and they learned that both those judgments had been completely wrong. Ada's limp never went away, and her scar never faded. But Elijah told his children those things made their mother who she was, and who she was happened to be the most remarkable person he had ever known. The children believed him because they saw the truth of it every single day. Samuel Hartwell lived long enough to see his grandchildren running through the ranch that Elijah and Ada had transformed, and before he died, he told anyone who would listen that the mountain man's choice had been the work of God, or destiny, or whatever force guides people toward wisdom. He said he had been blind to his own daughter's value until a stranger saw it clearly, and that shame and gratitude would stay with him until his last breath. Carolyn and Margaret both visited their sister often, and though they never said it directly, their eyes showed they understood that Ada had won something far more valuable than they had. The townspeople of Timber Ridge eventually stopped talking about the strange choice Elijah Stone had made, not because they forgot, but because the evidence of its rightness was impossible to deny. The mock daughter and the mountain man had built something beautiful together, and their love story became the standard against which other marriages were measured. When Elijah and Ada were old and gray, sitting together on the porch of the ranch they had saved and built into something magnificent, visitors would sometimes ask Elijah why he had chosen Ada that day on the courthouse steps. His answer never changed. He would take Ada's weathered hand in his and say that he had chosen her because she was the only one worth choosing, because real value has nothing to do with a perfect face or an unblemished body. He chose her because he saw strength where others saw weakness, saw beauty where others saw flaws, and saw a heart that years of rejection had not managed to make bitter or small. He chose her because even a mountain man who had spent 15 years alone knew that Ada Hartwell was extraordinary, and he would have been a fool to choose anyone else. Ada would squeeze his hand and rest her head on his broad shoulder, and they would watch the sunset together in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had found exactly what they needed in each other. And so the story of the father who offered his daughters and the mountain man who chose the one everyone mocked became legend in Colorado territory, passed down through generations, as a reminder that wisdom sometimes comes from unexpected places, and that the most important choices we make are the ones where we see with our hearts instead of our eyes. Elijah Stone, the savage from the mountains, had taught an entire town that true worth cannot be measured by society's shallow standards, and Ada Stone, the girl everyone pitied, had proven that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest gift of all, because it means you have nothing to prove to anyone except yourself. Their love story survived long after they were gone, living on in the memories of their children and grandchildren, teaching each new generation that the most valuable things in life are often the ones everyone else walks right past without seeing, and that choosing to see differently, to value differently, to love differently, is what separates the truly wise from the merely clever.